The wind in West Texas has a voice, and on the Llano Estacado it speaks of solitude and sorrow. For Sarah O'Connell, a widow running a homestead miles from any neighbor, that voice was her only constant companion. But on one moonless night in 1878, a different sound pierced the darkness, a cry that was too human to be an animal, and too desperate to be anything but trouble. She was a woman who had already lost everything to this unforgiving land. Now, armed with nothing but a burning log from her hearth, she would have to face the darkness to save a life that wasn't her own, sparking a chain of events that would pit her against her own people and forge an unforgettable legend in the heart of Comanche. The silence of the plains was a living thing. It wasn't an absence of sound, but a tapestry woven from the whisper of prairie grass, the distant mournful call of a lone dove, and the relentless sigh of the wind across the flat, unforgiving earth. For Sarah O'Connell, this silence had become the measure of her days and the ghost in her nights. It had been a year since Thomas, her husband, had been taken by a fever that swept through their homestead like a prairie fire, leaving her with nothing but a half-finished barn, 30 acres of stubborn soil, and a loneliness so profound it felt like a constant physical weight. Her cabin, a sturdy structure of cottonwood logs, chinked with mud and grit, stood as a solitary monument to their shared dream. Now it was just her shelter. By day she was a whirlwind of motion, mending fences, tending her small flock of goats, hoeing the dusty vegetable patch, and hauling water from the creek that cut a jagged scar through the southern edge of her property. Her hands, once soft and suited to the needlepoint she'd learned back in Missouri, were now calloused and cracked, stained with the dirt of her survival. But when the sun bled out across the horizon, painting the vast sky in hues of violent orange and bruised purple, the work ended and the silence descended. Tonight was no different. The fire in the stone hearth crackled and spat, casting flickering shadows that danced like specters on the rough-hewn walls. Outside, the moon was a sliver, offering little comfort against a darkness that seemed absolute, a black ocean stretching to the ends of the earth. Sarah sat at the small, rickety table Thomas had built, cleaning his old Colt Peacemaker, the metallic scent of gun oil, a familiar, almost comforting aroma. The gun was more a tool than a weapon in her mind. She'd used it on rattlesnakes and the occasional rabbit for the pot, but the thought of pointing it at a man turned her stomach. Still in this land, a lone woman was a temptation for forces both natural and human, and the weight of the steel was a necessary reassurance. She was about to bank the fire for the night when she heard it. At first it was faint, nearly swallowed by a gust of wind that rattled the shutters. She froze her head, cocked, every nerve ending tingling. It came again, sharper this time. It was a cry, thin and reedy, a sound of pure distress. Her first thought was a bobcat kitten, or perhaps a fox caught in a snare. The wild creatures of the plains made 1,000 strange noises in the night. She dismissed it, turning back to the fire. But the sound persisted, rising and falling with a desperate cadence that tugged at something deep within her. It wasn't the sound of an animal. There was a distinctly human quality to it, a note of infant terror that chilled her to the bone. Who would be out here, the nearest settlement? Redemption Creek was a hard day's ride east. No sane person traveled the Llano at night. No one. A darker thought slithered into her mind. Comanche. The word itself was a whisper of fear among the settlers. The great war chief Quanah Parker had surrendered a few years back, leading his Quahadi band to the reservation at Fort Sill. The papers in Redemption Creek said the Indian wars were over. But Sarah knew better. the land remembered. There were still renegade bands, proud warriors, who refused the white man's road, who hunted and raided in the old ways. They were ghosts on the plains, spoken of in hushed, fearful tones. Had a raiding party passed through? Was this a trick, a lure to draw her out of the safety of her cabin? Thomas's voice echoed in her memory, a low, steady rumble. Never you mind what's skittering in the dark, Sarah girl. You lock that door and stay by the fire. Ain't nothing out there worth your life. She bolted the door, her heart hammering against her ribs. She took the Colt, its wooden grip cool and solid in her sweaty palm, and stood by the single window, peering into the oppressive blackness. The crying continued, punctuated by a new sound, a chorus of sharp, excited yips and snarls. Coyotes. The sound of the pack galvanized her. All thought of ambush, of tricks of Comanche warriors, evaporated, replaced by a primal, horrifying image, a helpless creature, whatever it was, being torn apart in the dark. The crying reached a fever pitch, a raw shriek of terror that sliced through her fear and struck a chord of pure, unthinking compassion. It was a baby. She was sure of it now. A human baby. She couldn't. She shouldn't. It was madness. But the sound of the snarling coyotes, growing bolder and closer, made the decision for her. She couldn't listen to a child die while she stood safe by her fire. Her own womb was barren, a source of quiet grief she and Thomas had shared. Perhaps that was it. The cry of a child in need was a call she was physically incapable of ignoring. With a sob of frustration and fear, she unbolted the door. The Colt felt useless. Firing into the dark at a pack of circling shadows was a fool's errand. She needed light, and she needed a weapon that would command respect from a starving animal. Her eyes fell to the hearth. The fire had burned down to a bed of glowing orange coals, with one thick log of mesquite burning bright and steady. Without a second thought, she snatched a heavy leather work glove, thrust her hand into the searing heat, and pulled the burning log from the fire. It was heavy, trailing a plume of ochred smoke and a shower of brilliant embers. The heat was immense, scorching the air around her, but she barely felt it through the adrenaline coursing through her veins. Holding the firebrand aloft like a torch from some ancient saga, she plunged out into the night. The cool night air was a shock after the warmth of the cabin. Her torch cast a wide, dancing circle of light, pushing back the absolute dark and revealing the scene of the drama. Not 50 yards from her cabin, near the edge of the dry arroyo, the drama was unfolding. A pack of at least half a dozen coyotes, their forms lean and spectral in the firelight, were circling a small, dark bundle on the ground. Their eyes gleamed like chips of green glass, and their lips were pulled back in hungry snarls. The cry was coming from the bundle. "Get away! Get back, you devils!" Sarah screamed, her voice raw. She charged forward, brandishing the burning log. The lead coyote, a big male with a ragged ear, turned to face her, lowering its head and letting out a guttural growl. For a terrifying second, she thought it would lunge. But the sight of the roaring flame, the unfamiliar aggressive scent of thick smoke, and the sheer audacity of this lone human female was too much. The beast hesitated, took a step back and then another. Sarah didn't stop. She ran straight at them, swinging the firebrand in a wide, dangerous arc. Embers flew through the air like angry fireflies. One landed on the dry grass, which flared up for a moment before she stamped it out with her boot. The coyotes broke and scattered their courage, failing in the face of the fire. They melted back into the darkness, their yips turning from predatory to resentful as they retreated. Panting, her lungs burning from the smoke, Sarah stood over the bundle. Her torch illuminated it clearly now. It was a cradle board, a Comanche cradle board, intricately decorated with dyed porcupine quills and geometric patterns of glass beads. Tucked inside, wrapped in soft rabbit fur, was a baby. Its face was smeared with dirt and tears, its dark eyes wide with terror. It couldn't have been more than a few months old. As she stared down at the infant, her torchlight caught something else nearby. The splintered shaft of an arrow fletched with hawk feathers, and a few feet away, the glint of metal, a spent brass cartridge, the kind used in the Army's new Springfield rifles. A cold dread far deeper than the fear of the Coyotes settled over her. This wasn't a lost child. This was a survivor. Somewhere, very recently, there had been a clash of terrible violence, and she was standing right in the middle of it. She reached down, her hands trembling, and lifted the cradle board. The baby, exhausted from its ordeal, let out a final shuddering whimper and fell silent. Holding the Comanche infant in her arms, Sarah O'Connell stood alone under the vast, indifferent Texas sky, the smoking Firebrand in her hand, the only thing separating her from a world of trouble she could not yet begin to comprehend. Back inside the cabin with the heavy wooden bar bolted securely across the door, the world shrank to the small circle of light cast by the lantern she'd lit. The Firebrand lay smoking in the hearth, its job done. The air was thick with the lingering smells of mesquite smoke, ozone, and the faint, sweet scent of the infant. Sarah placed the cradle board gently on the rough, spun wool blanket of her own bed. For a long moment she simply stared, her mind struggling to catch up with the night's events. The child was silent now, its dark, almond-shaped eyes watching her with a startling, solemn intensity. Its skin was the color of polished copper, and a tuft of jet-black hair peeked out from the rabbit fur wrappings. It was a beautiful, perfect child, a Comanche child. Her hands, still shaking, moved to examine the cradle board. It was a work of art, a testament to a mother's love. The wooden frame was wrapped in supple, brain-tanned deerskin. The beadwork was exquisite, a cascade of blue and white beads forming symbols Sarah didn't understand, but could feel the significance of. A dragonfly, a symbol of swiftness and protection, was stitched near the top. Small buckskin pouches, likely containing protective herbs, or a piece of the child's umbilical cord, were tied to the sides. This was no ordinary baby. This was the cherished child of a family with status, with pride. A wave of nausea washed over her. What had happened to that family? The spent rifle cartridge and the broken arrow told a grim story. Cavalry patrol, buffalo hunters. The possibilities were all drenched in blood. She imagined a frantic mother trying to flee, perhaps falling from a horse, losing her precious cargo in the chaos and the darkness. Had she been killed? Or was she out there now, wounded, searching desperately for her baby? The thought was a knife in Sarah's heart. The baby made a small fussing noise, its tiny mouth working. It was hungry. Of course it was hungry. Panic, sharp and practical, pierced through her shock. What on earth did you feed a baby this small? Her own experience was non-existent. She had her goats, goat's milk. Was it too rich, too strong? She had no choice. Working with a clumsy tenderness, she unlaced the buckskin ties of the cradle board and carefully lifted the infant out. It was a boy. He was wrapped in layers of soft hides, and a small amulet on a leather thong carved from a piece of turquoise rested on his chest. He was clean and well cared for. Beneath the tear-streaked dirt, he was a picture of health. She held him against her shoulder, the warmth and weight of him, a strange, powerful comfort. He was so small, so utterly dependent. All the loneliness of the past year seemed to coalesce into this one moment, this one small life in her arms. She felt a fierce, protective instinct rise up in her, an instinct that had lain dormant and grieving. "All right now, little one," she whispered, her voice husky. "Let's see what we can do for you." Milking her nanny goat Patience by lantern light was a surreal experience. The goat bleated nervously, unused to a nighttime milking. Sarah worked quickly, her mind racing. She diluted the milk with a little boiled water from the kettle, just as she'd heard women in town say. She didn't have a bottle. She found a clean strip of linen, dipped it in the warm milk, and gently touched it to the baby's lips. At first he turned his head away, confused, but the scent of the milk registered, and his mouth latched onto the cloth. He began to suckle his small fists, clenching and unclenching. Sarah sat on the floor by the fire, holding the baby, patiently re-dipping the cloth every few moments. It was a slow, laborious process, but with every drop he took, a knot of tension in her own chest loosened. He was safe. He was fed. For now. But "for now" was a fleeting thing on the Llano. As the baby drifted off to sleep in a makeshift bed she'd fashioned from a wooden crate, and her softest shawl, the full weight of her situation, crashed down upon her. Keeping him here was impossible. She was a white woman. He was a Comanche boy. In the eyes of the world, her world that made them enemies. If she was found with him, the best she could hope for was to be branded a sympathizer, an outcast. The worst didn't bear thinking about. Lynch mobs had formed for far less. Sheriff Brody the Law in Redemption Creek was a man known for his unyielding hatred of all Indians, a hatred born from a personal tragedy everyone in the county knew about. His wife and daughter had been killed in a Kiowa raid a decade earlier. He would see this child not as an innocent, but as a serpent's egg. And what of the boy's own people? If they were alive, they would be searching. What would they think finding their child in the cabin of a white woman? They might see her as a kidnapper, a monster. They wouldn't know about the Coyotes. They would only see the theft of their future. Her isolated homestead would be the first place they'd look. She could be killed, her cabin burned to the ground, before she had a chance to utter a single word of explanation. She was trapped between two warring worlds with a sleeping infant as the fulcrum of her fate. Sleep was impossible. She sat in the rocking chair Thomas had made for her, the colt resting on her lap, and watched the baby sleep. Every gust of wind was the sound of approaching hoofbeats. Every creak of the cabin walls was a footstep outside her door. She thought of Thomas, of his steady, calming presence. He would have known what to do. He would have been practical. Take the child to the fort, he might have said. Let the army handle it. But Fort Elliott was 100 miles away. And what would they do with a Comanche baby? Send him to a reservation, to an orphanage back east, where he'd be raised to forget his language, his people, his own name. The thought felt like a betrayal. This child belonged to the plains, to the people who had crafted his beautiful cradle board and tied the turquoise amulet around his neck. As dawn approached, painting the eastern sky in soft shades of grey, and rose, a decision began to form in her weary mind. It was a terrible risk, but it felt like the only honourable one. She couldn't keep him, and she couldn't give him to the authorities. She had to go to town, not for the sheriff, but for information, She needed to know if there were reports of a skirmish. She needed supplies, more suitable cloth, for feeding perhaps a word of advice from Doc Miller, a man who, despite his cantankerous nature, valued life above politics. She would have to hide the baby. The thought of taking him into Redemption Creek was unthinkable. She could leave him here for a day. He would be safe enough hidden in the cabin. She could ride in, get what she needed, listen to the town gossip, and be back before nightfall. As the first rays of sunlight slanted through the window, the baby stirred. He opened his eyes and looked at her, and for a moment he smiled. It was a fleeting, gummy, gas-induced smile, but it struck Sarah with the force of a physical blow. It was a spark of trust, of innocence, in a world that had none. Moses. She whispered the name coming to her unbidden. Found in the reeds, saved from the water, saved from the wilderness. I'll be back for you, little Moses, I promise. She fed him again, his suckling now stronger and more confident. She secured him in his makeshift bed, placing it in the small root cellar beneath the floorboards, where he would be safe from prying eyes and the heat of the day. As she covered the trapdoor with a rug, the silence of the cabin returned, but it was different now. It was a heavy, expectant silence, filled with the presence of the secret she now carried. She saddled her mare, a sturdy buckskin named Dusty, her movements economical and practiced. She slipped the colt into her saddlebag, a grim necessity. As she rode away from the cabin, she didn't look back. Looking back felt like an admission of fear. But she could feel the cabin behind her, a tiny, fragile bastion, holding the most dangerous and precious secret of her life. The future was a blank page, and she was riding straight into a story she was not sure she would survive. The ride to Redemption Creek was an exercise in vigilance. Every shimmering heat haze on the horizon could be a rider. Every dust devil dancing in the distance could be a signal. The sun beat down, turning the air into a furnace. Sarah pulled her hat low, her eyes scanning the vast, empty landscape. The emptiness itself was unnerving. The world felt scrubbed clean, as if waiting for the next act of violence. The memory of the spent cartridge and the broken arrow was a constant nagging worry. Redemption. Creek announced itself first as a smudge of darker brown against the pale tan of the plains, then as a collection of stark, unpainted wooden buildings huddled together as if for warmth. It was a town born of dust and desperation, a stopover for cattle drives, a supply point for isolated homesteaders, and a haven for men whose pasts were best left unexamined. It had a church, a saloon, a general store, a blacksmith, and a sheriff's office, which was all any town truly needed to call itself civilized. As she rode down the town's single dusty main street, she could feel the eyes on her. A lone woman was always a curiosity. A lone widow like Sarah O'Connell was a subject of endless speculation and gossip. She tied Dusty to the hitching rail in front of Miller's Mercantile, the largest and best-stocked store in town. The bell above the door jangled, announcing her arrival. The air inside was cool and smelled of coffee beans, cured leather, and bolt cloth. Martha Miller, the proprietor's wife and the town's primary switchboard of information, looked up from behind the counter. She was a thin, bird-like woman with eyes that missed nothing. "Sarah O'Connell," she said, her tone a mixture of surprise and pity. "It's been a while since you graced us with your presence. The ride in treating you all right?" "It was fine, Martha," Sarah replied, forcing a calm she didn't feel. "Just needed a few supplies." "I should think so. A body can't live on grit and grief forever." Martha said, her eyes already cataloguing Sarah's dusty clothes, the tension in her shoulders. Heard anything from the west? Any news from the patrols?" Sarah's heart gave a little jump. "No." "Why has something happened?" Martha leaned forward conspiratorially, lowering her voice. "Well, Clayton Munro and his boys, the buffalo hunters, rode in 2 days ago. Said they had a run-in with a Comanche hunting party up near the Canadian River breaks. A real skirmish from the sound of it. Clayton was boasting about it over at the saloon. Said they taught him a lesson." A cold knot formed in Sarah's stomach. The Canadian River breaks were not far from her homestead. A lesson. What kind of lesson? "Oh, you know Clayton," Martha said with a dismissive wave, full of hot air and cheap whiskey. "But he and his boys were shooting their Sharps rifles. Said the Comanche scattered. Can't imagine they did much more than scare them off, but it's got everyone on edge. The Sharps rifle. A heavy caliber weapon. A spent cartridge." The pieces clicked into place with horrifying certainty. Clayton Munro and his band of callous hunters had likely ambushed a family or a small band, killing or scattering them, and in the chaos the baby had been lost. Her blood ran cold. "I see," Sarah said, her voice tight. "I need some linen cloth, the softest you have, and a small tin of sweetened condensed milk." Martha's eyebrows shot up. "Condensed milk? What on earth for Sarah? Planning on some fancy baking? Something like that?" Sarah lied, avoiding her gaze. "And I need to see the doc. My hand—" She held up her right hand. She hadn't even noticed it until now, but a nasty-looking blister, red and angry, had formed on her palm where she'd gripped the burning log. Martha's suspicion was momentarily replaced by concern. "Good heavens, child, what did you do to yourself?" "Careless with the fireplace," Sarah mumbled. "Just need him to look at it." She paid for her goods, her hands trembling as she counted out the coins. She could feel Martha's gaze boring into her back as she left the store. The gossip was already taking flight. The sheriff's office was next door. Through the window she could see Sheriff Brody at his desk. He was a bull of a man with a thick neck and a face that seemed permanently set in a scowl. A large, drooping mustache failed to hide the bitterness in his mouth. He looked up as she passed his eyes, cold and assessing. She hurried on. Doc Miller's office was at the far end of town, attached to his small house. The place smelled of carbolic acid and stale pipe smoke. The doc himself, a man named Elias Miller, Martha's much quieter brother-in-law, was a stark contrast to the rest of the town. He was an educated man, from back east, with weary eyes that had seen too much death and foolishness. He was known to be gruff, but fair. "Well, Mrs. O'Connell," he said, not bothering to get up from his chair where he was reading a medical journal, "what fresh hell has the prairie visited upon you?" "My hand," she said, showing him the blister. He grunted, finally getting up to examine it. "Firebrand?" he asked, his touch surprisingly gentle. Sarah flinched. "How did you know?" "Seen it before. Usually on a drunk cowboy trying to prove something. You've been fighting something off in the night." He looked at her shrewdly. "Coyotes, or something on 2 legs." "Coyotes," she said quickly. Too quickly. He didn't press. He lanced the blister with a clean needle, applied a salve that stung fiercely and wrapped her hand in a clean bandage. "Keep it clean. You're lucky it's not worse." He then looked at the items she'd bought from the mercantile, which she'd placed on a nearby table. "Linen and condensed milk. That's an odd combination for a burn." Sarah's resolve crumbled under his intelligent gaze. She couldn't tell him everything, but she needed advice. "Doc, hypothetically, if a person were to find, say, a newborn goat an orphan, would diluted goat's milk be all right, or would this condensed milk be better? Doc Miller stopped, his eyes narrowing. He looked from the supplies to Sarah's face, to her bandaged hand, and a flicker of understanding, or at least deep suspicion, crossed his features. He knew she didn't have any newborn goats. He walked over to his cabinet and took out a small box. "This is powdered infant formula," he said, his voice low. "I keep it on hand. Lost a mother in childbirth a few months back. Tried to save the baby. Didn't make it." He pushed the box towards her. "It's better than goat's milk. Mix it with boiled water. And if this orphan you found happens to not have 4 legs, be careful, Sarah. Be very, very careful." He didn't ask for payment. He just looked at her, a warning and a strange sort of compassion in his tired eyes. The world out here isn't kind to strays, especially not the 2-legged kind that look different from us. Just as she was about to leave, the door to the clinic flew open and Sheriff Brody filled the doorway. His eyes flickered between the Doc Sarah and the box of infant formula in her hand. "Sarah O'Connell," he boomed, his voice accusatory. "Martha said you were in town asking questions about the Comanche. Said you bought some mighty strange supplies." Sarah's blood turned to ice. "She's a patient of mine, Brody," Doc Miller said coolly, stepping between them. "Her business is her own." "Not when it involves savages," Brody snarled. "Clayton Monroe's boys confirmed it. They ran off a war party. But there's talk one of the Braves was seen lurking around the O'Connell place just this morning. A tracker, maybe, looking for something." Brody's eyes locked onto Sarah's. "You seen anything, woman? You hiding something out there?" The directness of the accusation stole her breath. This was it, the moment her world could unravel. I haven't seen anyone," she stammered, clutching the box of formula so tightly her knuckles were white. "The only thing I fought off were coyotes." Brody stared at her, his gaze unwavering, trying to peel back her lie with the force of his will. He didn't believe her, not for a second. "That homestead of yours is right in the middle of their path. If you see anything, you report it to me. Anything. You hear me? We don't harbor their kind. We don't help them. We eradicate them." The venom in his voice was chilling. He glanced one last time at the infant formula, then at her bandaged hand, a dark calculation forming in his eyes. He turned and left without another word, his heavy boots thudding on the boardwalk. Sarah stood, shaking her legs, feeling weak. "You need to go," Doc Miller said, his voice barely a whisper. "Go now. And God help you, Sarah, because I don't think anyone else can." She fled. She untied Dusty with her good hand mounted up and galloped out of Redemption Creek as if the devil himself were on her heels. She didn't look back, but she could feel the town behind her, a place of suspicion and hate. And she knew with a terrible certainty that Sheriff Brody would be watching. She was no longer just a lonely widow. She was a suspect, and the fragile life she had hidden in her cellar had just become the most dangerous secret in all of Texas. The ride back to the homestead was a blur of fear. Every shadow seemed to hold the form of Sheriff Brody or one of his deputies. Every gust of wind carried the imagined sound of hoof beats. Sarah pushed Dusty harder than she ever had before the urgency, a cold, hard knot in her gut. She had walked into the lion's den and walked out with his scent all over her. Brody knew. He didn't have proof, but he knew she was hiding something, and his hateful mind would have already leaped to the most inflammatory conclusion. When her cabin finally appeared on the horizon, a tiny, vulnerable speck in the vastness, she felt a surge of relief so powerful it almost made her weep. She half fell from the saddle, leaving Dusty panting by the water trough, and rushed inside. After bolting the door, she scrambled to the rug, pulled it aside, and lifted the heavy trapdoor. The cabin was silent. For one heart-stopping moment, she feared the worst. But then she heard it, a soft, rhythmic breathing. Peering into the cool darkness of the cellar, she saw him. Little Moses was still sound asleep in his crate, his chest rising and falling peacefully. He was safe. She lifted him out, holding him close, his warmth a reassurance against the chill of her fear. His eyes fluttered open, and he looked up at her, his expression calm and trusting. That simple, innocent trust was both a comfort and a terrible burden. How could she protect it in a world so determined to crush it? The rest of the afternoon was spent in a state of heightened alert. She mixed the formula Doc Miller had given her, and the baby took to it, eagerly feeding with a vigor that spoke of his underlying strength. She changed his wrappings, cleaning him with a soft, damp cloth. As she cared for him, a quiet bond began to form. She found herself talking to him, her voice soft, telling him about the homestead, about Thomas, about the stubbornness of the goats. He just watched her, his dark eyes, seeming to understand more than any infant should. As dusk began to settle, she knew she couldn't put him back in the cellar. If Brody or his men came snooping, it would be the first place they'd look. She had to keep the baby with her. Every noise outside the cabin sent a jolt of adrenaline through her. She sat in the rocking chair, the baby cradled in one arm, the Colt peacemaker resting on the table beside her. The setting sun cast long, ominous shadows that crept across the floorboards like grasping fingers. Night fell, and the immense silence of the plains returned, but now it felt different. It was no longer the silence of loneliness, but the silence of a siege. She was a prisoner in her own home, besieged by the threat from the town on one side and the unknown intentions of the Comanche on the other. Who was she more afraid of? She found to her surprise that the thought of Sheriff Brody's cold, hate-filled eyes filled her with a more profound dread than the thought of a grieving Comanche father. Exhaustion gnawed at her. She hadn't slept properly in 2 days. Her body ached, her bandaged hand throbbed, and her mind was weary from the constant circling fear. She must have drifted off in the chair, the baby sleeping soundly on her chest. She was woken by a sound so subtle it barely registered, a soft scraping against the front door. Not a knock, not the splintering of an axe, just a gentle whisper-light touch. Her eyes snapped open. Her heart leaped into her throat. The fire had burned low, filling the room with deep shadows. The baby was still asleep. Slowly, silently, she reached for the Colt, her fingers curling around its familiar grip. She slid from the chair and crept towards the door, her stockinged feet making no sound on the wooden floor. She stood by the door for what felt like an eternity, her ear pressed against the rough wood, listening. There was nothing, just the wind. Had she dreamed it? Then she saw it. A sliver of color in the crack beneath the door. Something dark. Something that hadn't been there before. Terror warred with a desperate need to know. Brody wouldn't be this quiet. A posse would be loud, aggressive. This was something else. This was the stealth of the plains. Taking a deep breath, she lifted the heavy bar from the door. It made a groaning sound in the stillness. She pulled the door inward, just a crack, peering out into the moonless night. There was no one there. The prairie was empty, silent, stretching out into the blackness. But her porch was not empty. Her breath caught in her throat. Draped over the door, hanging from the frame, and folded neatly on the porch steps were blankets. Not the rough wool trade blankets from Miller's Mercantile. These were Comanche blankets, at least 3 of them. They were magnificent, woven with intricate geometric patterns in deep reds, blacks, and yellows. One was a buffalo robe, tanned to the softness of velvet, with the life story of a warrior painted on the inside in bold pictographic symbols. Another was a large, heavy weaving so tightly made it would turn away the hardest rain. The last, draped directly over the doorknob, was smaller, exquisitely soft, made from the pelts of dozens of white winter weasels stitched together. It was a gift, an astonishingly valuable, deeply significant gift. A buffalo robe like that was a man's history, his wealth. A blanket of weasel pelts was fit for a chief's child. This wasn't just a thank you. This was a statement. They had been here. They had watched her. They had seen her fight off the Coyotes. They had seen her take the child into her home. They knew. And instead of arrows and fire, they had left her a gift of honor. They were thanking her for protecting their son. Sarah stepped out onto the porch, the cold air raising goosebumps on her arms. She reached out and touched the weasel pelt blanket. It was impossibly soft. This was the work of a mother's or a grandmother's hands, a labor of love that had taken months, perhaps years. To leave it here, it was a gesture of profound trust and gratitude. She looked out into the darkness, but there was nothing to see. They were gone as silently as they had come. They were letting her know they were close, that the child was under their watch, but they were also giving her a choice. They hadn't stormed her cabin to take the boy. They were respecting her, acknowledging her act. They were treating her not as an enemy, but as a guardian. A tear slid down her cheek, hot against her cold skin. In one night, her entire understanding of the world had been upended. The savages of Sheriff Brody's hateful rhetoric had shown more grace, more honor than anyone in the so-called civilized town of Redemption Creek. They had seen her actions, not the color of her skin. She carefully gathered the blankets, her movements reverent. The buffalo robe was heavy, smelling of wood smoke and sage. She brought them inside and laid them across the foot of her bed, their vibrant colors a stark contrast to the plain, hard, Scrabble reality of her life. They were a whisper from another world, a world that had just touched hers in the most unexpected way. She knew this wasn't the end. It was a reprieve. A message had been sent, and now a response was awaited. They would be back for the child. But the fear that had gripped her for 2 days was beginning to transform. It was still there, a low hum of anxiety about what was to come, but it was now mingled with a sense of wonder and a strange, fierce pride. She had done the right thing, and in the heart of this dangerous, lonely land, someone had noticed. Holding little Moses a little tighter, Sarah finally felt a sliver of peace. She was no longer just waiting for a confrontation. She was waiting for a meeting. The next 2 days passed in a strange, suspended reality. The magnificent Comanche blankets, draped over her furniture, transformed the drab cabin into a space of vibrant color and unspoken promises. Sarah cared for the infant, whom she continued to call Moses, with a growing affection that both warmed and terrified her. The hollow space in her heart, carved out by Thomas's death, was now being filled by this small, trusting life. This attachment, she knew, would make the inevitable parting a new and terrible kind of grief. She felt a constant, watchful presence around her homestead, but it was no longer menacing. It felt like a protective embrace, a silent guard keeping the dangers of the prairie at bay. On the morning of the third day, they came. They did not storm the horizon, but appeared as if from the earth itself, 3 riders cresting the low ridge to the west. They moved at a slow, deliberate walk, their posture conveying a solemn purpose, not aggression. Sarah's heart began to pound, a frantic drum against her ribs. This was the moment all her fear and hope had been leading to. She had rehearsed it in her mind 100 times. But now seeing them, she knew that suspicion and fear were the wrong tools for this meeting. Trust had been offered, and it had to be met in kind. Leaving the sleeping baby inside, she stepped onto the porch, her hands empty and open at her sides. She stood there, a lone figure in a faded dress, and waited. The lead rider was a man of immense presence. He sat on his war pony with an innate dignity, his face a mask of stern grief. He was broad-shouldered, his long hair braided with otter fur, an eagle feather tied at the back of his head. This was clearly a man of authority. Beside him rode an elder, his face a web of wrinkles, and a younger warrior whose tense eyes darted across the landscape. They stopped 30 yards away, a respectful distance. The chief's gaze swept over her, then to the door of her cabin. There was no threat in his eyes, only a powerful, questioning sorrow. The elder dismounted and walked forward, his hand-raised palm open. "Español?" he asked, his voice raspy with age. "Un poco." Sarah replied, her voice trembling slightly. "A little." The old man nodded. He introduced the chief as Ta Napanu, meaning sunrise. He introduced himself as Isimanica, or Old Owl. His eyes, ancient and wise, searched hers. "We saw," Old Owl said, his Spanish slow and deliberate. "We saw the sky dogs, the coyotes. We were too far wounded from the hunters' guns. We saw you come from your house with fire." He made a motion with his hand, mimicking her swinging the firebrand. "You fought for him. You saved the son of our chief." The confirmation was staggering. This tiny infant was the son of the proud man before her. "His mother?" Sarah asked, her heart clenching in dread. "She is with us," Old Owl assured her. "Her horse fell. Her leg is broken, but her heart is broken more. She sent the white weasel blanket." He paused, letting the weight of his next words sink in. "It was a gift. From a mother. To a mother." Those words struck Sarah with the force of a physical blow. They had seen not an enemy, not a white woman, but the universal spirit of a mother protecting a child. Tears welled in her eyes. "Please," she said, gesturing to the cabin. "Come." It was a monumental risk, but it was the only human thing to do. Ta Napanu dismounted and walked towards her. His eyes fixed on the door, as if he could see through the wood to his son inside. But just as he reached the porch steps, a new sound shattered the fragile peace, the thunder of galloping hooves from the east, from the direction of town. Sarah whirled around, her heart plummeting. A cloud of dust rose, and from it emerged at least 10 riders moving fast. At their head, unmistakable even at a distance, was the furious, bull-necked form of Sheriff Brody. The young Comanche warrior let out a sharp cry, his knife flashing in his hand, a movement instantly checked by Old Owl's firm grip and a sharp Comanche command. Ta Napanu froze his body, tensing like a coiled spring. He turned his grieving face, transforming into the hard mask of a war chief, his hand instinctively going to the bow, slung over his back. The fragile bridge of understanding Sarah had just built was about to be burned to the ground. No! Sarah cried out, stepping between the chief and the approaching posse. Wait. This is a misunderstanding. Brody's men reined in their horses in a chaotic swirl of dust, forming a semicircle that trapped them against the cabin. Every man held a rifle. Brody's face was a mask of triumphant hatred. Well, well, Sarah. He spat, his eyes gleaming. Caught you red-handed, consorting with the enemy. He gestured with his rifle towards Tarnapanu. Come back to finish the job. Have you, killer? You're wrong, Sheriff, Sarah pleaded. They came in peace. They came for the baby. The baby. Brody laughed, a harsh, ugly sound. So there is a baby, a little savage whelp you've been hiding. I knew it. You're a traitor, Mrs. O'Connell. Tarnapanu did not understand the words, but he understood the venomous tone and the pointed rifles. He spoke a low, dangerous command in Comanche, and his young warrior notched an arrow to his bowstring. The moment had arrived. Her life, the lives of these men, and the life of the baby inside all hung on a thread. Fear was a cold hand on her heart, but something else rose to meet it. A hot, righteous anger at the blind injustice before her. She planted her feet firmly in the Texas dust. No, she said, her voice ringing with an authority that surprised them all. You will not shed blood on my property today, Sheriff. You will not point your guns at a father who has only come for his lost son. She held Brody's hateful gaze for a second longer, then made her final stand. If you want to shoot him, she declared, her voice unwavering, you will have to shoot me first. Then she did the unthinkable. She turned her back on the sheriff and his posse, a gesture of ultimate defiance, and faced Tarnapanu. She held his gaze, trying to convey a silent message of trust before walking into the cabin, leaving the two armed hostile groups staring at each other over the impossible chasm of her courage. The silence that followed Sarah's disappearance into the cabin was absolute and terrifying. It stretched for what felt like an eternity, a taut wire of tension that could snap at any moment, unleashing a volley of gunfire that would soak the dry earth in blood. Outside, Sheriff Brody's face was a mask of rage, his knuckles white on his rifle. He was being defied by a lone woman in front of his men. Across the dusty yard, Tarnapanu stood like a statue carved from rock. His eyes locked on Brody, ready to meet violence with the grim finality of his people. Inside a storm of fear and resolve warred within Sarah. There was no choice, not really. There was only the right thing to do, a path illuminated not by courage, but by simple, unshakable decency. Her hands, surprisingly steady now, went to the wooden crate. Little Moses was awake, his dark eyes watching her with innocent trust. She lifted him, wrapping him carefully in the impossibly soft weasel pelt blanket his mother had sent. For one last moment, she held him close, his warmth, a familiar comfort against the ache in her chest. A single tear fell onto his cheek. Be strong, little one, she whispered. Your people are waiting. When taking a fortifying breath, she walked back to the doorway and stepped onto the porch, the baby held securely in her arms. The sight of her with the Comanche infant was a physical shock to the posse. The abstract idea of a savage whelp was one thing, the reality of a beautiful, healthy baby wrapped in a pristine white blanket was another. A ripple of disbelief went through Brody's men. These were ranchers and farmers, not soldiers. They had come to fight warriors, not to witness the reunion of a father and his son. Several men unconsciously lowered their rifles. Tarnapanu's eyes fell upon his child, and the warrior's stoic mask dissolved completely, replaced by a look of such raw, overwhelming love that it was breathtaking. A soft sound, a choked gasp of a name escaped his lips. Sarah walked down the 3 steps of her porch, placing herself directly in the no-man's land between the 2 groups. She walked slowly, deliberately towards Ta Napanu, her back to the armed posse. "See, Sheriff," she called out, her voice clear and steady in the still air. "This is the monster you came to hunt." She stopped and turned, forcing them all to look at the peaceful child in her arms. A lost baby, who I found crying in the dark, about to be taken by coyotes. I did what any decent human being would have done. I saved his life. His father has come to thank me and take him home. That is the entire story. "That child is a trick," Brody bellowed, his authority faltering. "A bargaining chip. They'll burn you out the second they have him." It was Doc Miller who finally broke the spell. "Put the gun down, Brody," he said, his voice cutting through the tension with weary reason. "For God's sake, man, look at his face. Can't you see you're wrong, just this once?" "Stay out of this, Doc," Brody roared, but the seed of doubt had been sown. Sarah ignored him. She turned and walked the final few feet to Ta Napanu, whose entire being was focused on the child. She held the baby out to him. For a moment, the great chief seemed almost hesitant, as if overwhelmed by the moment. Then, with a reverence that was deeply moving, he reached out his strong arms and took his son. He cradled the infant against his chest, murmuring soft, guttural words in Comanche, burying his face in the soft blanket. The younger warrior and old owl stepped forward, their hard faces alight with joy, each touching the baby's head with a gentle finger. Finally, Ta Napanu looked at Sarah. The gulf of language and culture between them was immense, but in that moment, their shared humanity formed a perfect unspoken bridge. There were no words for the gratitude, respect, and sorrow that passed between them. He reached up and gently untied the single perfect eagle feather from his braided hair. It was a sacred object, a symbol of the highest honor of courage and of a connection to the Creator. He held it out to her. Sarah took it. The feather was light as air, but felt as heavy as a lifetime of meaning in her hand. This simple, profound gesture of peace was a more powerful weapon than any rifle. It shattered the posse's fragile resolve. One of the ranchers lowered his rifle completely and spat in the dust. "This ain't right, Sheriff," he declared. "I'm done here." Another man followed suit, then another, their aggression turning to shame. Brody watched his authority evaporate into the hot Texas air. He was left isolated, his hatred a lonely, impotent thing. With a curse torn from his bitter soul, he wrenched his horse around. "You'll regret this, Sarah O'Connell," he snarled. "When they come back to burn you out, don't come crying to me for help." He spurred his horse and galloped away, a solitary figure of rage disappearing back towards town. The rest of his men followed more slowly, refusing to meet Sarah's gaze. Only Doc Miller remained long enough to tip his hat to her, a silent, profound gesture of respect. Before turning away, Sarah was left alone with the 3 Comanche men. Ta Napanu gave her one last long look, a look that acknowledged her sacrifice and her strength. He nodded his head once, a gesture of kingly respect, then mounted his pony, his son held securely against his heart. Without a backward glance, they rode west, carrying their future with them, melting back into the vast, wild land that was their home. Sarah stood and watched until they were just specks on the horizon. She was alone again. The silence returned, but it was changed forever. In her hand, she clutched an eagle feather. She was an outcast, a woman who had defied her own people. But as she looked at the wide open sky, she did not feel afraid. She had found a strength she never knew she possessed. Her future was uncertain, but her spirit, once as barren as the plains around her, was finally resiliently at peace. The story of Sarah O'Connell is more than just a tale of the Old West. It's a powerful testament to the fact that true courage isn't about how fast you can draw a gun, but about your willingness to stand for what is right, even when you stand alone. In a world defined by conflict and prejudice, she chose compassion. She listened to the cry of a child instead of the voices of hatred, and in doing so, she forged a fragile bridge between two warring worlds. Her story reminds us that history is not just made by famous generals and gunslingers, but by ordinary people who in extraordinary moments choose to act with extraordinary grace. These are the stories we strive to bring you, the forgotten legends, the quiet acts of heroism that truly shaped the world we live in. If Sarah's story moved you, please give this video a like and share it with someone who appreciates a tale of true grit. And don't forget to subscribe and hit the notification bell so you never miss another incredible story from the annals of history that deserves to be remembered.